This is our final seminar of the convention, and it's the 7th one. And I think it's the only one where the title has not been changed. And I love the catchy to it, Sex, Coins, and William Wood. So you know it's got to be interesting, and maybe not a whole lot different from what's going on nowadays, who knows. But anyway, it's really nice to introduce and to thank Frank Noel for doing this. He's done seminars for us for many years, and it continues to entertain us and give us information that we never knew. That's what everybody likes. So Frank, from the Early American Coppers Club, we really thank you for presenting this seminar, Sex, Coins, and William Wood, and Making Small Change in the 18th Century, as part of our convention here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. So to give this presentation some non-numismatic context, I punctuate it with 18th century music. And Chuck has been vexed all day about people changing their titles. And I do have to tell you that I give some thought to changing my title. Given my generation's affinity for drugs, sex, and rock and roll, I thought about calling this Coins, Sex, and Classical Music. But it lacked rhythm, so I decided to stick with the title, and I think I've pleased Chuck by doing that. So.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. You're the man.
Frank, I think that's a perfect title. I mean, that's exactly right.
Having said that, I do want to start with a little snippet of 18th century music. So bear with me. So that little snippet, played by jazz trumpeter Wynton Marsalis, was from a piece called Ode for the Birthday of Queen Anne, composed by George Frederick Handel upon a visit to London in the early part of the 18th century. Throughout this presentation, Handel will be popping up, kind of like Zelig or Forrest Gump, to continue to offer some context for the coins we're going to be talking about. Handel visited London in 1710 and again in 1712, and he and his music were immediately popular. So impressed by Handel was Queen Anne that she granted him a pension of £200 a year for life, even though at the time he was not even a British subject. Anne, for whom that music was written, was the Queen of England from 1702 to 1714. She was the last Stuart monarch. Many think that the Stuart dynasty ended with the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when Parliament forced the abdication of King James II and invited William of Orange and his wife Mary to become co-monarchs. Mary was the daughter of James II, and as such had her own claim to the throne. William was the grandson of England's King Charles I, who had lost his head during the English Civil War. But after Mary and William both died, the crown passed to Mary's sister Anne, who, like Mary, had been raised an Anglican, even though their father, James II, was dethroned for being too Catholic in an England that had grown accustomed to being Protestant. While Anne's most notable accomplishment as queen is likely the 1707 Act of Union that joined Scotland and England into the United Kingdom of Great Britain, early American copper collectors remember her for issuing what is known as a proclamation for settling and ascertaining the current rates of foreign coins in America. This proclamation is the genesis of the phrase proclamation money, which is found throughout much of the literature about early American coppers. Queen Anne was the subject of a 2018 film called The Favorite, for which Olivia Colman won an Oscar playing her. And in the film, Queen Anne is depicted engaged in a sexual triangle with two women. At best, the existence of such a love triangle between the Queen and her aides is theatrical speculation. While there is contemporary evidence alluding to rumors about the Queen's sexuality, most historians discount the rumors as political propaganda. Anne died in 1714, giving rise to the Hanoverian succession, which is important to our story about William Wood. So, although she spent much of her childbearing years pregnant, none of her children survived to adulthood. Many were stillborn or died in infancy. And Anne died, as the lawyers say, without issue, meaning with no living offspring. Years before, while William, who outlived Mary, was still king, Parliament anticipated this precise situation, and in 1701 adopted the Act of Settlement. When Anne died in 1714, under this Act of Settlement, the English throne passed to the Elector of Hanover, George Ludwig. Hanover was a province in Germany, or located in what we today would call Germany, but which was then still called the Holy Roman Empire. George spoke no English, he spoke only German, and because he was from Hanover, he and his successors, George II, George III, and George IV, are called the Hanoverian dynasty. At the time, George's wife, actually ex-wife, Dorothea, was imprisoned in Germany and never accompanied him to England and was never recognized as the Queen of England. So let's take a look at this remarkable woman who spent the last 30 years of her life imprisoned for adultery. This is Sophia Dorothea. She was born into a marriage where the mother and father were of unequal social rank, and under the law that prevailed at the time, this made her ineligible to marry into the social class of the higher-ranking parent. But when she was 10 years old, through some legal maneuvering by her parents, she became an eligible heiress, and in an arrangement made by her father with the father of George Ludwig, Dorothea married the future King of England in 1682. She was 16 years old. Although the marriage produced two children, one of whom would later become George II, the marriage failed. Both George and Dorothea found lovers outside the bond of marriage. By 1692, Dorothea was romantically involved with a Swedish nobleman, Philip Christoph Count von Königsmarck, who was in service to her husband's brother. The couple lacked discretion. Their affair was an open secret in Hanover, and in July of 1694, while on his way to visit his married lover, the Swedish Count von Königsmarck disappeared and was never heard from again. Historians speculate that George had him murdered. By December of 1694, George and Dorothea's divorce was finalized. Dorothea was ordered to never marry again, and her ex-husband ordered that she be imprisoned under house arrest for the remainder of her life. The love letters exchanged between Dorothea and her Swedish lover survive in an archive in Germany and have provided the basis for both a novel and a screenplay about their doomed extramarital love affair. 20 years later, in 1714, when her ex-husband became the King of England, he never mentioned even having a wife, and she continued to be confined in Germany, where she lived for another 12 years in custody before she died in 1726. Meanwhile, while Dorothea was cavorting with her Swedish lover, her husband George had started fathering illegitimate children with this woman, one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, Melusine von der Schulenburg. He acknowledged none of his illegitimate children, who were instead described as the daughters of Melusine's sister. Nevertheless, when he became the King of England in 1714, his mistress Melusine and their daughters followed him to England, while his ex-wife languished in custody. Once in England, George bestowed multiple titles on this mistress, including, importantly for our purposes, the Duchess of Kendal. As George never learned to speak English, he relied on Melusine to manage many affairs of state, much like a president today might rely upon a chief of staff. In this capacity, the Duchess of Kendal made large sums of money by shamelessly exploiting the king's authority over public offices, titles, and patent rights. George's subjects, both in Hanover and in England, did not care much for Melusine. In Hanover, they called her the Scarecrow, and in England, they called her the Maypole. Most notably for our purposes, in exchange for £10,000, the Duchess of Kendal sold to William Wood a patent to strike coins for use in Ireland. A separate patent to strike coins for use in the American colonies was also issued about the same time. Earlier I mentioned that George Frederick Handel was going to pop up from time to time, and here he is again. What I didn't tell you earlier is that when he first visited London and wrote some birthday music for Queen Anne, he had just taken a job back in his native Germany as the Kapellmeister, or director of music, for a German prince, George, the Elector of Hanover. After his 1710 and 1712 visits to London, Handel returned to Hanover and took up his duties as music director to the Elector George. Eventually, though, Handel was drawn back to London, and after George became the King of England, Handel composed for him some of his most enduring music. This he wrote to accompany a royal boating party on the River Thames in the summer of 1717. It is known to history as Handel's water music. But this presentation is about coins, particularly the coins of William Wood, known to numismatists as Wood's Hibernia coinage and Wood's Rosa Americana coinage. So let's get to the coins. In the early 18th century, both Ireland and England's American colonies suffered from a severe shortage of small change. England treated Ireland and her American colonies very much alike. They were both dependencies whose sole economic purpose was to enhance England's position in the international mercantile system. To alleviate these shortages of coins, William Wood had a plan. Before Sidney Martin came along, not much academic attention had been paid to these coins. In 1903, a physician hobbyist named Philip Nelson published a small 42-page book, a pamphlet really, called The Coinage of William Wood, 1722 to 1733. In addition to Nelson's 1903 pamphlet, a handful of colonial collectors had published articles in esoteric numismatic journals and collected data on these coins. Sidney Martin drew upon the work of these predecessors and made the study of Wood's Hibernia and Rosa Americana coinage part of his life's work. He produced a coffee table-worthy treatise on each of the series. Combined, the two books total nearly 1,000 pages. Martin established an entirely new taxonomy for identifying and classifying the multitude of dye varieties in both series, apparently to the consternation of Roger here, who had started collecting these coins by dye variety identified by Nelson. But Martin scrapped it all and started from scratch with an entirely new taxonomy. There's a plethora of dye varieties in both the Hibernia and the Rosa Americana series. While many collect them by dye variety, today we're going to focus solely on the dates and denominations of these two series of coins. Sidney Martin, as most of you know, had an enormous collection of coins, and before he died in January of 2021, he had decided to consign his collection to Stack's Bowers. Since 2022, Stack's Bowers has sold over 5,000 of Martin's coins in 12 full-scale named auctions, 6 with published paper catalogs, and 6 online-only auctions. As recently as August of 2024, Stack's had said there are still thousands of coins yet to be sold. Martin's frontline Hibernia and Rosa Americana coins were contained in parts 2 and 5 of the Stack's Bowers auctions. So let's start with the Hibernia coins. Wood's Hibernia farthings and halfpence are dated over a period of 3 years, 1722, 1723, 1722, 1723, and 1724. So a date and denomination set of the Hibernia coins can be completed with just 6 coins. Wood owned some iron and copper mines and thought supplying small change for Ireland would be a way to monetize his mine holdings. He had in mind vertical integration well before the 20th century. He obtained the patent in 1722 and spent the better part of that year making dyes and setting up a mint. The patent was to run for 14 years. In January of what we would call 1723, he struck his first Hibernia coins, farthings and halfpence. Though struck in 1723, these first coins are dated 1722, because at this time England still followed the Julian calendar, under which the new year began on March 25th. So in England at the time, what we would call January 1723, they called January 1722. England did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until nearly 30 years later. The coins were initially readily received, and the people in Ireland appeared grateful to have them. But by August of 1723, trouble was afoot. Some merchants began to grumble and reject the coins. So let's pause here to take a look at these coins. I'm going to show you 6, 2 each, farthing and halfpence, dated 1722, 1723, and 1724. With the exception of the 1722 farthing, examples of each date and denomination are readily available, and attractive specimens can be had at affordable prices. This is the 1722 farthing. Like all the Hibernia coins, the obverse features a portrait of King George I with an abbreviation for, by the grace of God, King. The reverse displays a personification of Hibernia playing a harp, a well-known attribute of Ireland, and the date and the Latinized legend, Hibernia. There's only one die marriage for the 1722 Hibernia farthing. You'll notice that the harp is on the left as you look at the coin straight on. If you're Hibernia playing the harp, it's on your right. This is the only variety to have the harp in that position. The 1722 farthing is always in demand from both date and denomination collectors like myself, as well as from die variety collectors. That, coupled with its scarcity, make it a key coin that is always in demand and always demands a premium. This is the 1722 halfpence. Like the farthing, it features King George on the obverse and the harp, the Hibernia legend, and the date on the reverse. While the 1722 farthings have only harp left reverses, there are over 30 die varieties of the 1722 halfpence, some of which have the harp on the left and some on the right. This is the 1723 farthing. There's nearly 50 varieties of the 1723 farthing, all of which have the harp on the right as you look at the coin. And this is the 1723 halfpence. There's well over 150 die varieties of the 23 halfpence, all of which have the harp on the right. And this is the 1724 farthing. There's less than 10 die varieties for this, and they all have the harp on the right. And this is the 1724 halfpence. There's more than 10 die varieties of the 1724 halfpence, all of which have the harp on the right. There's also a small handful of rare and extremely rare die variety patterns for both the farthing and halfpence, which are beyond the scope of this presentation. So I mentioned before we started inspecting the coins that they were initially readily accepted. Indeed, the specimens I've just showed you demonstrate they were well struck from well-made dies, and they replaced what contemporaries called tickets of tin and leather that had been used to pay workmen before Wood's coins arrived in Ireland. But by August, through some organized efforts, some merchants began rejecting Wood's coins. In September of 1723, the Irish Parliament petitioned the king to withdraw the coins. The king refused, but the controversy continued. In March of 1724, this man, Jonathan Swift, who we remember today primarily as the author of Gulliver's Travels, became involved. In addition to being a gifted writer, Swift was also Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, Ireland. In 1724, Swift escalated the subject of Wood's coins into the larger political struggle between Irish patriots and their exploitative neighbors and overlord, England. Swift anonymously wrote a series of public letters to the people of Ireland under the pseudonym M.B. Drapier. Swift's letters were all written, published, and circulated individually in 1724. but as early as 1725, a book-length collection of all the letters, together with some ephemera, was published. Two other editions appeared during Swift's lifetime in 1730 and 1735. If anyone's interested, David Fanning has, I think it's the 1730 edition of the Drapier Letters in his May 31st auction. I don't know if he brought it with him here or has it in the Bourse where he's set up, but it's kind of pricey if you're into antique books. Swift's letters stirred up opposition to William Wood personally and his coinage patent. The first letter dates from March of 1724. Being a professional writer, he eloquently expressed the objections of many in Ireland. His letters complained that the coins were being introduced among them by this English man with a patent from the English king to strike small change in England for use by the people of Ireland. The coins, said Swift, were underweight, overvalued, and that the Irish market was being saturated with them. Despite an assay of the coins conducted at the direction of then Royal Comptroller Sir Isaac Newton that showed the coins to be good copper and within acceptable limits for weight, Swift did not back down. As he continued the controversy, he expanded his complaints to now include that the assay itself was a fraud. That is, the coins tested had been specifically prepared for the assay. In being singled out for criticism by Jonathan Swift, William Wood was in good company. Here, George Frederick Handel pops in again. In 1742, years after Swift's kerfuffle with William Wood, Handel, who by now was at the height of his popularity, was preparing to debut in Dublin a new work he had composed. The performance required many singers and other musicians, many of which had day jobs at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where Jonathan Swift was still the dean. Swift hated music. He once wrote, "I would not give a farthing for all the music in the universe." And he liked Handel even less than he liked music itself. As Handel was preparing for his Dublin debut, Swift issued a letter to everyone associated with his cathedral, threatening to punish to the fullest extent allowable any church musician who participated in any way with Handel's Dublin production, expressly singling out any songsters, fiddlers, pipers, trumpeters, drummers, or drum majors. For reasons that are not entirely clear, shortly before Handel's initial performance, Swift relented and allowed his musicians to work with Handel, who, on the Tuesday before Easter Sunday in 1742, presented to the world something he called simply Messiah. So both the British and William Wood eventually conceded they were in a lose-lose situation. And Wood negotiated with the Crown to relinquish his patent in exchange for a payment of £24,000 payable over an 8-year period. So what happened to the coins? It's been conventional wisdom since at least the 19th century that when the people of Ireland rejected the coins, they were shipped to the American colonies for use over here. That has historically been the reason for including the Hibernia coins in the American colonial series. They've appeared under colonials in the Red Book since its inception. But in the last third of the 20th century, some numismatists began to question the conventional wisdom. The first edition of the Red Book said, "The Hibernia coins were unpopular in Ireland, so most of them were sent to the American colonies." By 1977, the editors of the Red Book had changed that sentence to read, "Hibernia coins were unpopular in Ireland, so many of them were sent to the American colonies." By 2007, that had been diluted to, "Hibernia coins were unpopular in Ireland, so some of them were sent to the American colonies." And that is what the Red Book still says today. Sidney Martin wanted more clarity and more evidence, and devoted an entire chapter of his Hibernia book to investigating what happened to Wood's Irish coins. What he found was that the coins continued to circulate in Ireland at least until 1736, when England began providing Ireland with regal copper coins. But many, or should I say some, Hibernia coins did find their way to the American colonies, both coming with Irish immigrants who brought them over and from merchants who used them in trade with Americans. Although he found no hard evidence that the Hibernia coins were shipped in large quantities to the American colonies, Martin found that at least one contemporary writer stated, quote, "Surplus Woods coins would be shipped off to other countries." Martin also published a database and a map showing Hibernia coin finds in 11 of the 13 original states. Sufficient numbers to establish that they ended up throughout the American colonies. At the end of the day, Martin was satisfied that, though not made for the American colonies per se, these coins are now generally accepted as falling within the corpus of American colonials. So let's move on to the Rosa Americana issues, coins that were made for the American colonies per se. In addition to the patent to strike the Irish coins, a separate patent was issued to Wood to strike coins for the American colonies. Sidney Martin has produced a separate book devoted to William Wood's Rosa Americana coinage. Martin infers that the American patent cost Wood an additional £10,000. While the initial bribe for the Hibernia patent is well documented, there is no documentary evidence that a separate payment was made for the American patent. In any event, the Hibernia patent was issued in June of 1722, and the American patent followed in July. The patents were clearly intertwined, and William Wood ran the entire enterprise. We can see here the obverse of the American coins was identical to the design of the Irish coins. They are both dominated by a portrait of King George I. The same die sinkers made the dies for both the Irish and the American coins. The reverse of the American coins, however, feature the Tudor rose, an English symbol adopted by King Henry VII after his 15th century victory over the House of York in the decades-long War of the Roses. Henry, fighting for the House of Lancaster, sealed his victory by marrying his enemy's daughter, Elizabeth of York. The symbol of the Tudor rose is actually two roses, one superimposed on the other. One is white, representing the House of York, and the other red, representing the House of Lancaster. Because of this Tudor rose feature, the American coins go by the name of Rosa Americana. Also featured on the reverse of all Wood's Rosa Americana coins is the phrase, and I'm not sure I can pronounce it correctly, but it's utile dulci, useful and the sweet, which is taken from a Latin poet, Horace, who wrote that he gets all the applause who has mixed the useful with the sweet. The patent specified precisely the denominations, devices, and other details pertaining to the coins, right down to the composition of the metal from which they were to be struck. Wood's initial Rosa Americana coins, the ones dated 1722, failed to comply with the patent's requirement in two ways. First, the 2-pence coins initially failed to display the date. The solution to this issue was simply to start adding the date to the reverse of the coins subsequently struck. Second, and more importantly, the patent specified that the reverse was to include the image of the crown, and the coins dated 1722 failed to display the crown at all and featured only the Tudor rose. Wood resolved this issue by placing a crown atop the rose for the 1723 dated coins. The Rosa Americana coins failed to comply with the patent requirements in a third way, though this was not discovered until Sidney Martin wrote his book on the Rosa Americana coinage of William Wood. The patent for the Rosa Americana coins begins by detailing Wood's invention of a new, quote, composition or mixture that came to be called Bath metal. Bath metal consists of silver and brass. The patent specifies that Wood's new mixture would be used for the striking of the Rosa Americana coins. And this mixture is defined in some detail in the patent, and it requires that the metal to be used contain a specified amount of silver. Wood delivered a 20-ounce mass of this newly invented metal to the king so it could be tested. Wood knew that testing for the quantity of silver, as small as it was beyond the technical ability of the English mint. For his book, Martin had a professional metallurgical lab do some destructive testing on a handful of low-value Rosa Americana coins to see how closely Wood adhered to the patent's requirement regarding the makeup of his newly invented mixture. What Martin found was that the coins contained no silver. The Rosa Americana coins tested in the lab proved to be 99% brass with a smattering of lead, nickel, and iron, but no silver. The Irish coins were struck in Bristol, a location convenient to the supplies and convenient to shipping to Ireland. The Rosa Americana coins were struck at a facility in London, as the American patent expressly required that they be struck within the City of London or suburbs of the same. Wood's London facility was in a less desirable part of town. All of Rosa Americana coins were struck in what we would call 1723, the first coins being struck in January of 1723, though like the Irish coins, they are dated 1722, for the reason I mentioned earlier. 1723 would not begin until March 25th, so those coins struck after March 25th are dated 1723. In June of that year, Wood's London facility was destroyed by fire, and it never reopened. Martin estimates that no more than 4 million Rosa Americana coins were struck during the 6 months that the London Mint was in operation. There is some evidence that Wood was having trouble getting the people in America to accept his coins. In his March 1724 letter to the people of Ireland, Jonathan Swift, who we met earlier, implies that Wood's Rosa Americana coins had already been rejected in the American colonies. There does not appear to have been the same level of outrage or organized resistance to using the coins in America as Wood encountered in Ireland, but 2 years after the last coins were struck, Wood wrote a letter to every governor of every colony in America trying to persuade them to do what they could to get his coins accepted. But even absent the fire and the reluctance of the people to use the coins, Martin concludes that Wood had seriously miscalculated the opportunity. Even if everything had gone according to plan, over the 14 years of the patent, the Rosa Americana coinage project would have lost money. But like he has for the Hibernia coins, Martin has a database of coin finds showing that Rosa Americana coins circulated throughout the colonies, though not in great numbers and primarily in the southern colonies. So let's look at the Rosa Americana coins. This is the 1722 halfpence. Again, a complete date and denomination set can be completed with just 6 coins. This is the Rosa Americana 1 pence. You can see there is no crown on this coin. And this is the Rosa Americana 2 pence. Again, there's no crown, and indeed there was no date on the 2 pence coin. This is a Rosa Americana, where am I? I got lost. This is the Rosa Americana 2 pence. This is the 1723 halfpence. It's another coin I actually got from the Sidney Martin sale. You'll notice now he's added the crown on top of the rose to comply with the patent requirements. And this is the 1723 1 pence, also the crown. And you can see the date is also on here. Here's the crown, here's the date. So those things have been corrected. And this is the 1723 2 pence. So after the London facility burned to the ground in June of 1723, no further Rosa Americana coins were struck for circulation. There are a number of different patterns in different denominations dated 1724, but none of them were regularly issued. Wood never lost interest in coining, however. Philip Nelson discovered a reference in an 1893 work on currency of the British colonies, which he included as an addendum to his 1903 book. And in his addendum, he states that in 1728, 5 years after the burning of the London Mint, Wood proposed striking a new series of colonial coins. The coins would mirror the British gold and silver denominations, but would be stamped America and valued at 25% less than their British counterparts, nearly corresponding to the proclamation of Queen Anne. Wood's 1728 proposal went nowhere, but a unique copper coin that was in Sidney Martin's collection, shown here, may have been a pattern for Wood's 1728 proposal. You will notice if you look closely, this copper piece, dated 1727, features a portrait not of King George I, but of his son, the new King George II. In 1727, King George I died. He was succeeded by his son, George II, who we met earlier in this portrait with his sister and their adulterous mother, Dorothea. Young George came with his father to England and was made the Prince of Wales. And on the right, we see a picture of George II, painted years later. And here, our friend Handel will make his last cameo appearance for this presentation. For his coronation, the younger George commissioned Handel to compose an anthem. So to celebrate the occasion, Handel wrote something called Zadok the Priest and Nathan the Prophet, a piece that has been played at the coronation of every English monarch since, including most recently in the summer of 2023 at the coronation of King Charles III. There's also a handful of specimens that exist of yet another pattern for a Rosa Americana coin. This one dated 1733, 3 years after William Wood died. It was apparently struck by some of his sons who had been involved with him during his lifetime in the coin business. These pieces dated 1733 also never made it past the coinage stage, or past the pattern stage. So William Wood died on August 1st, 1730. His will, which he drafted a year before, made ample provision for his wife, 5 of his 6 sons, 1 son-in-law, and all of his daughters. But to one son, John, he left, in the words of the will, 1 shilling only. This phrase is a time-honored method of disinheriting people who would otherwise be considered a natural heir, like a son. Long ago, lawyers devised this mechanism of naming the person being disinherited by giving them a nominal bequest to avoid the contention that their omission was an oversight or a scrivener's error. So to bring this presentation full circle back to sex, at least one numismatic researcher has concluded that John's disinheritance was occasioned by a sexual indiscretion that had required John's father, William, to pay a substantial compensation to a domestic servant who had made a claim against John. So this sexual indiscretion cost John his inheritance. And with that bawdy detail, I will conclude this presentation on sex, coins, and William Wood. Does anybody have any questions? Hearing none, I thank you all for coming and for sticking with me to the end. Now go buy some coins at the auction.